Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next session in CME Palooza Spring. I am Scott Kober, one of the co-producers of CME Palooza, and I would like to close out the live tab so you don't hear me in the background, but I would like to welcome you to our session entitled Lighten the Load, Designing Efficient, Engaging Education Based on Cognitive Principles. This session is moderated by Karen Roy. Karen is the partner and co-founder of Infograph Ed LLC. So a few things, housekeeping items before we start this session. I would like to thank and recognize all of our sponsors, as we do before all CME Palooza sessions. Our gold sponsor, Academic CME. Our silver sponsors, ASIM, Creative Educational Concepts, and Prova Education. As well as our many bronze sponsors, the Academy for Continued Healthcare Learning, Answers in CME, Catalyst Medical Education, Catamount Medical Education, Clinical Care Options, CMEology, Global Academy for Medical Education, Global Education Group, Helio.com Education Lab, Integritas Communications, Infograph Ed, Postgraduate Institute for Medicine, Primary Care Network, PVI, RMEI Medical Education, Red Med Ed, Thistle Editorial, and Vindico Medical Education. So there are 3 ways to ask questions during this and every CME Palooza session. First of all, you can use the ASIM text line. The number is 267-666-0CME, that's 0263. You can also click on the Google Slides link found on the live tab of the CME Palooza website right above the video. This is a Scott session, so click on the Scott link. And you can also tweet your question to us using the CME Palooza hashtag. We've got a lot of really great questions throughout all of our sessions so far today, so hopefully there'll be a lot more coming for this session. So brief speaker disclosure, just be mindful that the opinions, discussions, and or conclusions expressed are those of our panelists and do not represent an endorsement by or position of their employer, parent company, or affiliates. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Karen to introduce her co-presenter and to start discussing this topic.
Thank you, Scott. And thank you for the introduction. And I'm joined today by Christine Considine. And I have to say, I need to give Christine all the credit because she brought the work we're going to discuss today, Dr. Richard Mayer's work on multimedia learning principles, to my attention last year. And I have a further disclaimer I'd like to make and follow on from Scott's last slide. I'm not an instructional design expert in any way, shape, or form. I'm not setting myself up for that in this presentation, but have been working in this field now for quite a long time. And I'm really interested in this topic. And I like to think I know what good looks like. And I'm interested sometimes to try and explore why things work, which I think is just as important. And when Christine brought this body of work to my attention last year, it just makes sense to me. And it's very practical and supported strategies that I talk about every day with my own team and with our clients on a daily basis when we're supporting them in development of their programs. So we're going to talk about lightening the load and how we can design education to support learners. So Christine will kick us off, and maybe we'll start with why was this of interest to you originally, Christine?
Thanks, Karen. So the prequel to this presentation really began over a year ago when Karen and I were talking about how advertisers actually effectively captured our attention, conveyed some kind of information, and in many cases have influenced us in some action-oriented way, much to the demise of my wallet many times. So that made me really think, how are advertisers successfully capturing my attention and influencing me? And, you know, we're all faced with this tsunami of new information and decisions to make every day, especially in technology that we encounter on a day-to-day basis. But our brains can only process a finite amount of information at once. So how do people learn in this modern age, and how do we, as educators and instructional designers, ensure it sticks? In other words, how do we design education that's impactful? And so when I went and searched for some answers, we came across this cognitive theory of multimedia learning that was developed by Richard Mayer, who's a professor of psychology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And he basically developed this theory to guide educators and instructional designers in the presentation of visual and verbal information for optimal learning. And so that's really the basis of our time today. And that image to the right is the theory that he pulled together. And today we'll talk about different kind of tips and tricks to designing efficient, engaging education based on those cognitive principles. So next slide. Our goals for our session. So Karen and I are going to talk about how we process information, just briefly, its relationship to Mayer's cognitive theory of multimedia learning, and what that theory's implications are for instruction. And ultimately, we'll talk about how we harness this information, how this all relates to what we do as educators and instructional designers. So next slide. So briefly, and first of all, I'd like to talk about how do we process information. So the information processing theory describes the mechanisms through which learning occurs, specifically from these three different cognitive processes: sensory memory, working memory, and long-term memory. Next slide. So the sensory memory. So information, if you can imagine, is coming in the form of stimulus like visual or sounds, and it enters our sensory memory. And with attention, sensory memory then is transferred over into working memory. And working memory has a limited capacity. So according to research, our working memory only holds on to information for a max of 7 years. But when the information is rearranged and organized in a very meaningful way, which we're going to talk about, it may activate some prior knowledge. And that information then moves into long-term memory, which is the goal. Our long-term memory is considered to be permanent and has unlimited capacity. So what is the relationship of how we process information in Mayer's cognitive theory of multimedia learning? So behind that busy flowchart that we looked at a little bit ago of Mayer's theory, there are three core assumptions underpinning what we'll discuss in the next few minutes. The first is the dual channel assumption, and many of you may be familiar with this already. We have two channels for processing visual and audio information. The second is that we have limited capacity. So we're limited in the amount of information that we can process in a channel at one time. So when an illustration or an animation is presented, we can only hold on to that for a few minutes or a few images in our working memory at once. That's the same for the auditory channel. So if you imagine a narration being used, we can only hold on to a few words in our working memory at any one time. So we really need to be mindful of the amount of text, graphics, and other media so we don't overload the learner's ability to process the information at any points that we're trying to drive home. It would take away from those main points. And then the third and final assumption is that of active learning or active processing. We engage in active learning by focusing on relevant information. So we organize that, we select that information into mental representations, and then integrating those mental representations with other knowledge. We are active processors, and we're seeking to make some sense of the content that's being presented to us, especially in multimedia learning. So we're not simply trying to push out as much information as possible into the memory like a tape recorder. We're essentially building upon our own knowledge. So I'm going to turn it over to Karen, and she's going to talk about What is this relationship and implication for instruction?
Thanks, Christine. So in the next slide, Scott, we can see that according to Dr. Mayer, a major challenge for instructional design is to promote appropriate cognitive processing by the processes of selecting, organizing, and integrating information without overloading the working memory. Again, reflecting back to our title of lightening the load, making things easier for our busy learners. So first of all, addressing selecting information, learners pay attention to relevant words and pictures in order to essentially create a word base and an image base in their sensory memory. Otherwise, the information quickly fades away. So they're looking for things to kind of latch on to as the key elements of the content they're trying to process. And then once that word and image base is formed, the second process is that we go into rearranging or organizing that selected information in our working memory. Because again, it has limited capacity. So we're trying to make space for it. We're trying to make a simple set of connections and starting to make sense of that information. And then the third step is integrating that information with prior knowledge. So as Christine explained, moving it into long-term memory, but not simply just moving it around, but making connections with what we know already so that we can integrate that into future decision-making, for example. So therefore, with good multimedia instruction, we should help our learners by reducing extraneous processing, and we're going to talk about that, fostering essential processing, which really focuses on the principle of organizing information, and then look at generative processing, which is that integration step. So we look at reducing extraneous processing first. And the core, I guess I should have said at the beginning, when referring to multimedia learning or multimedia presentations is simply the use of text and images. So again, harnessing those dual channels that Christine introduced us to a couple of minutes ago. So we know that people learn better from words and pictures than from words alone, but we really need to be smart about it and present it in a thoughtful way. So we're going to dive into some practical principles at this point. And the first thing we can do to help our learners is to remove extraneous information, not ask them to do extra work that does not serve the instructional goal. So there's 5 tips or guidances for this approach. One is thinking about simplifying the content as much as possible. And this is referred to as the coherence principle, and we'll give you some resources at the end of this presentation so you can refer to it later. But essentially, we know that people learn better when extraneous words, pictures, and sounds are excluded. So in other words, you just use your keywords, key pictures, key sounds, and if you don't need it, leave it out. Now that may be a challenge for those of you listening and watching who work with faculty and they want to put everything in, and Christine talked about those faculty members who give you everything in the kitchen sink and don't want to forget their friends and the research they've done, etc. But if it's not core to your instructional goals, it really shouldn't be there. We want to present and organize our information in a way that we're highlighting those keywords, pictures, and sounds, and that's referred to as signaling. People also learn better when images, graphics, and narration, rather than graphic narration and on-screen text. And sometimes you see things that have been put together and it's almost like things are competing for your attention. So in other words, often on-screen text is redundant and can cause a cognitive overload. So again, if you're using video and split screens, really pay attention to the amount of information that is being broadcast or shared with your learners at any one point, and not put the work on them to try and select and identify what you want them to pay attention to. That's referred to as redundancy. When you are working with text and images, place the text that's relevant near the image rather than at the bottom of the page. So again, think about how you're laying out your slides, for example. This helps the brain register the text and image as one piece, or one piece of information instead of two, and that's referred to as spatial contiguity. And following on from that, in order for text and images to count as one piece of information, they should be presented at the same time instead of one after the other. So for example, when words are spoken at the same time that the point is being illustrated on the screen, either in an animation or a video, think about the timing and make sure that things are planned and programmed and edited to make sense. And that's referred to as temporal contiguity. So moving on, I can give you a simple example of putting something like that into practice. And this is just a visual example. But here I've pulled a chart from a pharmacokinetics paper. Now that's never the most interesting data to share with people. It can be very dense. And in here you can see there's a graph that's pretty typical of this kind of data reporting. There's 5 different treatments, if you can see it. The curves are showing plasma concentrations for each of the treatments over time. Now, the main point of this work was actually to show the rapid onset of action of a rescue medication for seizures. So speed of action was important, but here you can see all the lines are bunching up within the first hour, and it's presented on a 12-hour timeline because that was the timeline of the study and all of the investigations that they did. So it's very hard to differentiate those lines there. You also have multiple bullet points on the slide highlighting different points. So we're really asking a lot of the reader or the learner to decipher this information and take the main point away from it. So a simple thing we can do on the next slide is to restructure that information, and what's been done here, you see immediately the graph has been redesigned. The doses and the different agents studied are given more prominence with color and the balls representing matching the lines on the graph. But more importantly, because we were looking at time of action, we've replaced the timeline on the bottom axis, just looking at the 60 minutes. So we're segmenting out the information that is critical to this learning point, and just highlighted one bullet point on the screen, that the median Tmax of the agent that was under study at all doses was 3 to 5 minutes faster than the comparator. So that was the point. We wanted to know which agents were going to work better as a rescue medication in epilepsy. And if you go to the next slide, Scott, there's actually a little video built into it where, again, going one step further and engaging the learner in a behavioral activity where they can engage with the content and actually drag that little slider along, and they are uncovering the data. They are seeing how the lines in the graphs sort of separate out. That really drives home the point and hopefully helps for them to not only decipher the information, but retain it. So we've used a couple of different strategies there to really support the learner and not expect them to do all the work and figuring out what was going on in the more traditional looking slide that we started with.
So with the extraneous cognitive load reduced, now we can focus on the second type, which is managing the essential cognitive processing. And that really represents the critical content of instruction. And one way to do that is through what's called a segmenting principle, which suggests that multimedia presentations should be really focused in learner-paced segments versus a continuous long presentation. A user should be able to pause and go back and watch different segments as they need to, or perhaps where that's not possible, being able to chunk up that information by providing chapters or tabs during those longer programs, and really be able to focus on those specific areas that you need to drive home. Additionally, to help manage that essential cognitive processing is what's called pre-training. So we know that people learn better from multimedia when they already know the names and components of the main concepts to build upon previous knowledge and engage in that active learning. So they talk about introducing objectives and key terms before diving into a big picture or deeper concepts. Just as we're going through these learning principles and then we're talking about how to put them into practice themselves. A third principle that's included in this is providing cues to highlight essential material, and it's helpful in guiding the learner throughout. So for example, if you're using a complex slide visual, which is pretty inherent in what we're doing on a day-to-day basis, you may want to use arrows or circles or highlight information as you go about presenting different aspects of the image or the text. So similar to what you might see in a live presentation where a faculty member is using their laser pointer to circle different pieces of information so that the learners are not getting overwhelmed.
Right.
So what we'll see on the next slide is a really basic example of this in practice from just a slide point of view. So in this example, this is pulled from the Society of Interventional Oncology. The France Foundation's worked with SIO to compose a series of on-demand activities for a few years now for their members. What I like about this is that it does a good job of highlighting some of the principles we just discussed. So you can see how we're providing some pre-training with some terminology being used around the areas of the liver. And then later on, the program puts this information into practice when actually performing the transplant. So we're going back to those terms and pointing out the different aspects. Again, just a very basic level of pre-training there. Right. And then on the next slide, and I think, Karen, this is something you want to talk to.
Yeah, and when we were talking about this and preparing this presentation, Christine, it kind of reminded me of one of the first things I was taught in presentation skills. And I'm probably dating myself now, but it was like, tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them. And not realizing that that's pre-training and segmenting up front and breaking things down. But one thing I always felt that we did, particularly in live education, because we're so busy to get going, is that sometimes there are learning objectives, and that introducing that terminology up front that you referred to, Christine, is buried in the housekeeping. The need statement, the learning objectives, and print matter, and it's run through really quickly in a live meeting. I saw a great example some years ago, and I remembered to give credit. It's I think this company, Educational Awareness Solutions, who had been working in the pain space for years. And I went to a breakfast symposium, and it was 6 o'clock in the morning, and people are more driven to get their coffee and their eggs than start thinking about what the learning objectives for the symposium was going to be. And as they were setting up and in the opening slides, the key presenter highlighted practice gaps in setting up the symposium via the use of outcomes data. And I had never seen this done before. So they basically said, you've probably been coming to this meeting for years. The topic was on opioid abuse and addiction overdose. We've been talking about management of risk with opioids for years. We know we're doing A, B, and C right, but X, Y, and Z, we're not moving the needle. And so when we come to that content, I'm going to highlight that for you. And people kind of, perked up and paid attention. He started the presentation. They had a format where they had a patient actor or simulated patient on the stage with him. And when he came to the section, I think it was urine drug testing, that, we can see from our outcomes data, we're not moving the needle on this. When he came to that section of the program, it was almost like he was, Kevin Spacey in House of Cards, and he took a second, and he's talking to the audience and saying, "Remember, I told you this. We're not getting this right. So this is what we're going to talk about in the next couple of minutes." So he called attention to that specific content. He highlighted it. He broke it out as a separate segment for the audience. And again, people put their knives and forks down, and they were paying attention and really tuning in because he had done that setup. And it's a low tech. You don't need anything except a well-trained speaker and the data to support that introduction. And it was incredibly effective. And that's always stuck with me, for the last 8 years, wherever long it's been since I saw that event, that it was a really very effective way of setting up the reason for being there in the first place. So he was harnessing some of these principles. I don't know if he knew that, but setting things up to help the learner pay attention to the essential content. Another example in an online setting, if you can move to the next slide, Scott, here is in this example of an online activity. What's been done here to embrace the segmenting principle essentially is sectioning out material in parts by use of a menu. So there's a little icon-based menu on the right-hand side of the screen here that covers the entire scope of the content. Now, if it's set up that a learner can navigate openly through it, they can choose which section they want to go to, which is also important for busy learners to allow them to make that choice. But it's organized in a way that they can see where the information is, and it's chunked or segmented out in easy to follow sections. So along the top there, you can see that we're talking about novel biologics and looking at particular cytokines or pathways that treatments may utilize to exert their effect. And moving deeper into the content on the next slide, you can see that, again, it's arranged in a way that when the reader has selected that biological pathway, the treatment options that work there are presented on the left-hand side of the screen here. So remember, we talk about placing things next to and temporarily related to each other. So the detail here, as opposed to a more traditional manner where perhaps in a presentation, the presenter may have chosen to walk through all the background first, do all the pathophysiology, and then do all the treatments first. Here it's broken down that it's side by side. And so it makes sense because it's connected, and we're helping the learner, supporting the learner making those connections, which is important to support them in holding the information in their working memory. So I think this is a nice practical example of lightening the load for the learner and helping them bring it together by organizing the content in a good way.
So that's a great segue into talking about our third and final tenet of multimedia learning, which is basically set out to increase the generative cognitive processing. And so what that is responsible for is helping the learner to organize and make sense of essential information. So very similar to some of the examples that Karen just talked about. So if you notice, as we're going through these examples and these principles and assumptions and these big research terms, all of these are interlaced. These are all related. They don't function in silos. And so with this last tenet that we're talking about, the three principles that I'm going to be talking about are related to the presentation of narration and helping the learner to connect with the content. So the first is the voice personalization principle, and that states that people are learning better when you're spoken to in a friendly human voice that's more conversational versus formal. Using terms like you, we, I, to help the learner feel like they're a part of the discussion, they're a part of the engagement, they're a part of this program, similar to the example that Karen was talking about, the faculty member coming forward and having that one-on-one dialogue saying, remember I brought this topic up before, so pay attention because here it is. I'm going to let you in on the secret. And then also the multimedia principle states that people learn better from words and pictures than from words alone. We've said that a couple of times in this presentation. This really allows people to build a personal connection between those verbal and pictorial models. So it's really unique to their own learning and their own ways of learning. And so similarly, not voice activated, but the tags that were just explored within the visual slide that was just shown, that Karen had, and that had that shared that same type of principle. In the next slide, you'll see a couple of different examples. The one in the center, very similar to the experience that Karen was sharing. This is derived from a live physician-patient demonstration that the AAD delivered during a workshop at one of their summer meetings, and then it was endured online. And what I liked about this example is that it really drives home the personalization aspects highlighted within our presentation. And so the demonstration really was illustrating how to conduct a psoriatic arthritis exam for early detection to prevent disability. Now, the key to the demonstration was not only to show how to conduct an exam, but personalize the information to meet a challenge that all the physicians in the room face. The exam needed to be conducted without adding time to the patient visit, and being able to do that in an effective manner. And the patient, who was a real patient, who expressed his own story and struggle about how long it took to be diagnosed, and in a very personal way, he addressed the ballroom, and he put out a call to action requesting them to ask their patients some very basic questions about their health that would ultimately help them to better care for their patients. And the faculty also personalized that demonstration by, again, talking to the audience throughout the demonstration, being relative to what he experiences on a day-to-day basis, or what happens, what he sees with his colleagues. And it helped to also select and integrate specific information that was just presented on the PSA awareness tool. Another example is in the, actually, if you go back one, in the upper right-hand corner, there's an image. Interactive videos and simulations are other examples, or ways to increase generative cognitive processing, and something I've been really excited about over the last couple of months. By requiring learners to engage in content through the use of branched logic and storytelling, it really empowers the learners to select information and organize it. And you get to provide that real-time feedback to the learner. It might help them to integrate that information into long-term memory by using those selecting, organizing, and personalized learning.
Thanks, Christine. So now what we've done is essentially walk through the basic principles of what's covered in Dr. Meyer's work on multimedia learning in his text. And we can now review this model in a little bit more detail. Hopefully you're more familiar with it. Scott, this is a bill, so we can move through it pretty quickly. So looking at the auditory or verbal channel, which is highlighted at the top here, we see that essentially what happens is words come in from the outside environment, which is, our content, new information that we're presenting to the learner. Then we hold this information in our sensory memory, which is short-term, on the next slide. And so it's starting to register with us, and we're building those verbal and bases. And then if you move on to the next slide, in working memory is where we're doing a lot of the work. We're temporarily holding this information, actively working on it, creating a verbal model, which is making sense. And as Christine said, none of this works in isolation here. So if you hear the word cat, you probably think of a picture of a cat, comes to mind. So sounds can create images too. And when we then move into the longer term memory, we're integrating the content. So we're presented with, ideally, if the education is well designed, we're presented with either challenges or actions that we take that challenge us to think a little deeper and integrate that content with our prior knowledge, make connections with this new information to be able to make sense of it. And that's what we know. We often use cases, for example, as a way of pulling it all together and personalizing it, as you said, Christine. You know, typical patients you may see in your practice, or here's the typical challenges or words a patient may use to describe their symptoms, etc. And then this process is essentially repeated for the visual channel. And the next few slides, Scott, and you can flick through them quite quickly. Again, we intake the information through our eyes. That's the stimulus for the sensory memory. We do the work and the working memory to create a pictorial model. And that is something that, particularly for people who consider themselves visual, might help embed the information, and then embed that with long-term memory and give us something to act on. So this is kind of a scary looking schematic, but hopefully those 5 steps have explained it. But that's what's going on, and we need to be aware of these to try and create strategies and develop our content in a way that supports the learner to harness this. So then what can we do as educators and educational designers? What should we be thinking of? What are the main things we should be thinking about? So one final representation of how we may learn is presented in 2 parts of the active learning experience, really. And if you think about it, we have behavioral actions that sometimes we're asked to take, and there's a level of cognitive activity as well. So when I talk about behavioral activity, it's things where there may be a hands-on activity, like a simulation. Or in the example you shared, Christine, you know, maybe if there was a workshop where you could work with a simulated patient or a patient actor to conduct a physical exam, for example. But engaging with the content directly replaces that as well in the online setting. A behavioral action can be something as simple as sitting in front of a computer and being asked to take some action, like, you know, answer a question or fill the blank, or using iPads in a live meeting session where you're holding your own iPad and again being asked to take action. We're behaviorally active. And there are some learning platforms that have harnessed that. I think the Archimedics platform has a lot of built-in actions, reminders, and nudges and things to help you make those connections. But we also need to be cognitively active as well, which promotes the most meaningful learning experience, where we're encouraged to place the material in context, make connections with that prior knowledge, as we discussed before. So that's really pulling it all together. And in the next slide, you'll see that essentially when we have a higher level of behavioral activity and a higher level of cognitive activity, we get the most effective active instruction, which fosters meaningful outcomes. And that's what we should be thinking about, striving for, harnessing the resources that we have available to us. So that really concludes our quick review of this work. Christine, do you have any final thoughts or anything you want to add that we may have skipped over?
Yeah, so I just, I think that bringing it back to one of our original conversations when we were talking about outside influences. So this is really great, I think, about how we could be continuing to work towards this to make things a lot easier for the learners. And again, the original example about advertisers or outside influencers, they're selecting information and they're personalizing it for us. And so, when I was originally thinking about, and pontificating with you about how are they doing it and how are they infiltrating, the way that we think, well, they're personalizing this for us and they make it as easy as possible to focus very specifically on information, helping us to organize it, and then perhaps integrating it in some manner that's relative to my life, my lifestyle, what's meaningful to me. And I think that it can really be helpful to reconsider how these processes relate to truly effective learning, especially within our industry.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking about this over the weekend. I will admit, sometimes I have QVC on in the background and I'm thinking, wow, these guys know what they're doing. You know, they break things down step by step. Let's show you how this works. Sometimes they have little models, you know, to show you how the new vacuum can pick up everything from dust to nuts and bolts. And can you imagine yourself doing this? You know what it's like when you have to clean your kitchen. Again, personalizing it, giving you the information, you know, anyone selling anything knows if they're doing it well, they're harnessing this. So I think it's a very good analogy to make with you know, the commercial arena.
Mm-hmm.
So in conclusion, and Scott, we can take questions because I know we've got some time remaining, but I wanted to share some resources with people before we moved on. First of all, if you like to learn by watching videos, if you Google Dr. Richard Mayer and multimedia learning, there are a number of videos out on YouTube. And some of them practice what he preaches, some of them not so much. But it's a good way to get a quick review of the work. Prompted by Christine, I actually bought the book, Multimedia Learning, 2nd edition. I think it's Cambridge University Press. Yes?
Yeah.
And on the InfographiC website, we actually distill down the 12 principles. So you heard me talking about things like spatial contiguity, just placing things next to each other, temporal contiguity, making sure that your audio is edited to track with the visuals on the screen. This list of 12 principles, as a quick reference, is available as a PDF download on the InfographiC website under the tab that's BizBytes. If you can't find it, let me know, but the link is at the bottom of the slide here. So hopefully that is a useful resource for you as you continue with your planning efforts. So thanks, Scott.
Okay, great. Well, we have a couple questions that have come in for you guys to consider. So this first question came over the ASIM text line. So, and this is probably for either of you. How do you convince old school faculty that this new way of learning is worth their time? Do you have any examples or suggestions that you could pass along?
I'm very lucky I don't have to work with faculty directly. So I'm like, do as I say, not as I do sometimes. No, but I think to me, I don't think it would take a lot of coercion to explain to a faculty member that their content is going to come across better if we can just help them select and organize it in a better way. It doesn't necessarily diminish what they want to present. I think the biggest challenge is, I mean, okay, so number one, sometimes people don't like you messing with their slides, but I think if they're done well, people can see that it's a better product after the fact, and they're grateful for that. I think the bigger challenge is the volume. And I think that is something that we have to deal with a lot, even in the CME community specifically, because the challenge of making sure everything we present is balanced. So if you select one clinical trial data set to demonstrate, you know, latest innovations in a therapeutic area, you know, you feel forced to then consider 3 others so that you're not highlighting, you know, maybe one product over another. And that adds to the amount of content and sometimes detracts from the main messages. So you have to think about how you're organizing that content, not to just have all this extraneous information out there and pare it back to what's critical.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up. I think that you hit the nail on the head about, you know, the first principle that we were talking about was reducing extraneous processing. And when there's boatloads of information, and again, I get it, you got to be able to cut through that to make sure that you're hitting those core messages. And so utilizing strong chairs and trying to work with faculty to get down to the meat and potatoes, like trying to get across, I think is really important.
I was actually, if I can share an experience, Scott, to maybe share a best practice. I was on a call recently with a client with some faculty, and the person on the call, the project manager and the lead for the medical education company, did a really good job at the outset of outlining what their learning objectives were and why. And when the discussion got into, hey, Fred, we could talk about this study or that study, they were very quick to step in and say, that's interesting, and maybe that's for another program, but this is what we're trying to do here. And it was handled very effectively. And, nobody got too upset, but it was explained to them why it wasn't going to be core to this information, and they got it. So again, just paring everything back to what are the key things you're trying to teach on.
So then, should the core amount of work to kind of generate more effective content fall on the faculty, or should it fall on the provider to take what the faculty has given them and kind of adapt it to these more effective sorts of formats?
I think it's definitely a shared responsibility and communication between the faculty and the folks that they're working with. I don't know what your experience is, but if you come back to a faculty with a completely new slide deck, they're not going to be very happy about it. So I think having some kind of discussion and a back and forth about how to accomplish the goals of what we're setting out to provide to learners, and what they have in front of them or what they've shared thus far is always good. And as always, it's a discussion back and forth about being able to deliver the content and the objectives effectively that we've set out to accomplish.
And if I can piggyback on top of that, I agree with you, what you said about the shared responsibility, but in my opinion, I think it's ultimately, the provider's job to ensure that what the content scope is matches the gaps identified and the learning objectives defined, because they are the educators. And we all know that brilliant doctors and the top thought leaders in the field are not always the best educators or the best speakers or presenters. So we do need to work in partnership with them to give them feedback, hopefully in a diplomatic way and in a way that they will take it on board to make the product better at the end. But that can be tough with egos. I get it.
I would also say that some of the formatting is really incumbent upon the MAC of the university who's working with the faculty and the way that the information is being delivered. Someone can be recorded, but the way that we chunk information up or provide, we're talking about archimetics at the moment, if you're going to provide a nudge or if we're going to provide additional downloadable materials, that information is coming from us. How do we segment information? If it's a webinar or something that's live streaming, we have control over highlighting text on a screen. If perhaps this slide is all text and it's bulleted and it doesn't have any imagery associated with it, using those principles in a different way. So perhaps there's 6 bullets listed on a slide and the faculty is not going to budge from that. Perhaps in the online version, you're highlighting certain keywords as the faculty is delivering that slide. So you're still able to foster that essential processing. You're still able to chunk those pieces of content into manageable sections so that we as the learner can really process those pieces individually.
Yeah, I think that's very practical advice. Like, it's good editing. You can turn a 10-minute monologue into something that's consumable in smaller pieces with that additional guidance provided.
So there's one final question on the ASIM text line, and this is probably kind of a good wrap up to this section. So I'll kind of abbreviate it a little bit. So while we would love to be able to take everything that we've learned from our short-term memory of this session into our long-term memory, we're only going to be able to take a few key bullet points. So what are those keys that we should be taking away from this session?
Nice question. I can start, Chris, if you don't mind. I mean, first of all, I would say you don't have to rely on your own memory. There's resources that we've shared as well. You can refer to a checklist and give yourself some help. For me, I would take it away. I think the organizing for me is the key here, because I think other things will fall into place. And Christine has talked about selecting and chunking information. And I think if you're aware of the capacity that somebody has to pay attention, we know that's not that long, present information in mini sections. So almost like you're crossing off your learning objectives one at a time. And then anything additional to that is secondary. But just start with your core content that addresses the gaps you've identified, put that in there. And then the rest is filler, and you may not need it. You may just be filling time for the sake of it. But start with that skeleton process and design the education or the educational content in a way that supports the learner. So thoughtful slide design. Sometimes more is more. Oftentimes I see, one very busy slide, and our recommendation may be to break it up into 3. It may not take any more time for them to go through it, because it's still what they're going to talk about in its entirety, but it's presented in a more comfortable way for the learner to follow along, because you're not asking them to decipher all of that information at once. You're segmenting it out and allowing them to follow both the auditory and the visual presentations.
I agree. I really agree with everything that Karen, you just had said. The only other thing that I would add to that is the personalization aspect. When I'm learning anything new, I always feel more included, in that it's more meaningful to me when a speaker is speaking directly to me, and it's relative to my universe. How am I going to take this away? What am I going to do with this information, just as we try to aspire to do today? So this theory that, this cognitive theory that came across a while ago, what does that really mean to us in our industry? And I think that that's really important. I mean, everyone likes to be spoken to and included in the conversation. And so I think that if you're doing live or online, that communication is an effective tool. It doesn't cost any more money. It's just the way that you're addressing the audience.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much to both Karen and to Christine for their feedback on this session and for their input. So for those folks who are watching this session either live or the recorded version, we do have a brief survey on the live tab of the CME Closer website that kind of helps us get a sense of how we did for this meeting and helps us plan for the future. So please complete that when you have a chance. For those who are watching this live, to view our next session, once this session is over, give it a minute or two, refresh your browser, and our next session will start at the top of the hour. So thank you once again, Karen and Christine, and we will talk to you guys soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.